Hey, I'm Tom, and I have been sculpting miniatures professionally for 20 years. In fact, that's what I want to talk with you about today. I've been reorganizing my studio and going through a bunch of old work files, and in fact came across a miniature that I sculpted 10 years ago. So enjoy me sculpting this blast from the past while I reminisce on 20 years of sculpting miniatures. If you'd like to learn more about sculpting miniatures and the techniques I use in this video as well as my others, you can get my ultimate guide to sculpting miniatures by clicking on the link in the description below. This is the Torchbearer miniature for Myth the board game. It's the second figure I ever sculpted for the Myth board game for MegaCon Games, and it was the last figure that I sculpted as a freelance artist before joining up with MegaCon Games to help them, to help lead their miniature efforts, sculpting many of the figures as well as directing others and commissioning sculptures. It was quite serendipitous that I found the footage for this figure when I did, because it represents several milestones. As I mentioned, I have been sculpting miniatures professionally for about 20 years now, and this figure happens to fit almost directly in the middle. I started sculpting professionally in the year 2003, and I don't know the exact dates when I finished those figures, the exact months. I lost that data over the course of time, but I do know that those were my first professional commissions. This figure was finished right at the end of 2013, just before I joined MegaCon Games as a full-time miniature sculptor, miniatures director. That means this miniature is a great representation of how far I had come in 10 years of sculpting, as well as where I was 10 years ago. It's right in the middle. I think a decade, and by association a score, is a great way to track and look back at how far you've come. Speaking of which, how many of you knew that a score was 20 years? I had heard it before, but never really thought about it until I was doing this video. That's a cool term. I think we need to use things like that more often. It makes it sound more interesting than 20 years. It's interesting as a culture that we don't celebrate the 20-year mark as much as I think we should. 10 years, a decade is something special, a quarter century, 25 years. I recently had other anniversaries come up. Last year was my 20th anniversary of marriage, and this year was my 20th year university reunion. And in both cases, as I was looking for special things or treatments, it came up that 20 years isn't considered that special. There was no special party. We had to put together our own sort of mock reunion, and it was a great time, but it was interesting that it doesn't seem to be as important as I think it is. Because if you think about it, 20 years hits almost every significant milestone as far as changes in your life and things you've gone through. Your first 20 years, you might still be in university, but you're definitely several years into adulthood. Another 20 years, I'm using the word years now instead of the score, but whatever. You're 40, and that's a midlife crisis range. You've spent an additional 20 years as a true adult. You've learned a lot. I know for myself, I've always heard that, about all these professionals and great people that did great things, and how many of them didn't actually achieve and accomplish things until they were 40. As a young man, I became impatient and wasn't sure I wanted to, or if that was true. I was worried that maybe it would never happen, but I can tell you it did. I definitely became more competent, more patient, more thorough. I could enjoy my art more and focus on it better. And so it's 20 years, or a score, is a very important perspective to look back on. Before I get too much farther in the video, I suppose I should take a moment to tell you a little bit about this sculpt and how I was working on it. This miniature is primarily being sculpted with Fimo Professional. As you can see, there's a couple little bits. You can see some green there. You have the shield, and there's a little bit of a green spot on the character's back. Now, this was because of a couple reasons. One, I don't almost never make pieces of equipment out of polyclay. I pretty much exclusively will prefabricate them using putties like Procreate or Green Stuff. And in this case, I did that with the shield. I sculpted that, and then I actually left some of the leg area uncovered by the polyclay and built up some excess Green Stuff putty to stick the shield to, so that could be a single piece. And then on his back, I knew he was going to have a large backpack, and I didn't feel confident that I could give it the dimension and details that I wanted by having it be a single piece. So I decided from the beginning when I was designing this miniature that it would have a socketed portion. And I wanted that socketed piece to be stable and consistent from beginning to end. So I went ahead and made that with the Green Stuff, let that cure, and then worked my way and sculpted around the figure. While I dabbled with sculpting for many years prior to getting into sculpting miniatures, it all began 20 years ago when I discovered Green Stuff via my mentor, Greg Faberg. And up until that point, or from that point on, for the first 10 years of my career, I pretty much was doing everything with putty. Not always Green Stuff, but that was always a staple of my workflow. So 10 years into sculpting miniatures, 2013, this figure, this really marks the point that I made a significant shift. I'm pretty sure most, if not all, of the miniatures that I did this year were primarily polyclay. Up until that point, I might have dabbled with it a little bit the year before, but there were definitely several putty miniatures that I was still sculpting. But from this point on, it was all clay all the time. So while it didn't take me another 10 years to make another significant shift in my sculpting, that being moving from traditional to digital sculpting, polyclay has remained my preferred material when sculpting miniatures traditionally. Here's some interesting data around my sculpting journey over the last 20 years. I've sculpted 365 miniatures since starting this journey. And a good friend of mine pointed out that, hey, that's just one miniature a day. But obviously, other things come into play, such as day jobs, other interests. So it's possible, but I decided to spread it out over 20 years. The next interesting tidbit is, after 10 years of sculpting, I had sculpted 132 miniatures. And of those, the vast majority of them had been putty. There were a little bit of dabbling or partial sculpts with polyclay, but the majority of it was putty. This next bit of information is really interesting to me. So I started at MegaCon Games in 2013, which is about the 10-year mark of my sculpting career. And over the next 2.5 years, I worked there sculpting exclusively for games like Mercs and Myth. And in that time, I sculpted 87 miniatures, all using polyclay. The very last miniature I sculpted for them was my first digital figure, and that was the castle, the broken castle city figurine of Farron Rock for Myth Dark Frontier, the board game. This data showed me a few different things. One, if you can focus all your time, or at least all your professional time, on sculpting, you can get a lot more miniature sculpting done. And this, I wasn't even full-time sculpting with this company. I had other responsibilities of coordinating and working with the other sculptors and planning the releases and the logistics of everything that would go in the board game and working with the factories. But when you are in an environment where you have more time and you're just surrounded by all the creativity of other people and driving the concepts, it can really help and let you dive right in and focus strictly on the sculpting. But I want to encourage you, even if you can't dedicate so much time to sculpting or your art and your craft, keep working at it a little bit every day or every month or even every few months. If you enjoy it and you keep working on it, you will improve. In my experience with both sculpting and drawing, I would have these times of hiatus where I would sculpt or draw for a extended period of time, and then I just left it. I left it aside, worked on other things, didn't come back to it. But I found that when I would come to it, even a year later, I was shocked at how much I still improved. Yes, you have to knock off the cobwebs, get back into the groove, but I think sometimes your mind needs a chance to process and digest everything you've been working towards and learning. I think the sculpts I did for Myth are some of the best I've ever done. But if you look at them, there is some progression, and I learned a lot, especially in certain aspects such as hands and faces. But in other ways, there's a bit of a sameness where I feel like I didn't strive in every way, or I got stuck in a certain style and look. Some of that was the art that I was working from and trying to match, but some of that was me being held and bound by certain paradigms in my own mind of how I thought that a leg should look or a proportion should be. So keep at it, even if you can just do it a little bit at a time. Thanks for joining with me and taking a look at what one score of sculpting miniatures looks like. If you made it this far, leave a old person emoji down in the comments section and let me know how long you've been sculpting and even how many miniatures you've done if you happen to know that. One thing I can tell you that even if you are a sorting and filing and hoarder nut like I am, you can still lose track of images. So I had to pull these from the old Myth Kickstarter. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep sculpting.